fairly simple Spring Boot concept of creating endpoints, and this endpoint was working directly with JPA. I think, yeah, we chose a JPA persistence layer. So if you guys remember, if you don't have the source code, by the way, let me cover this bit first. So since this is interactive, I always encourage you guys to like clone the repository and have the source code nearby, so that it's easier for you to like see what we are covering. So if you clone this repository, just share it on the chat. And also, I need to remember to share my screen. Yeah, so if you clone this repository, you'll be able to find some of the code that we did earlier, but especially this, which was the Spring Boot task we were working on. So I'd encourage you to clone it. I've already shared on the chat where you can find it. That is github.com/samueloino/KJUG JBE. So you can find it there, and yeah, and clone it so that as we do this session, you guys can also contribute, because the way we do this is, yeah, I'm not the only one doing it, so I'm getting ideas from you guys and we are implementing them together and seeing what happens. So perhaps a quick recap of what we're able to do. So the thing was split into 3 tasks. So there was this task entity layer, an entity layer task, and there was so the first task was establishing the entity layer. The second task was establishing REST endpoints, and so that was the second task, the REST endpoints, and then we were to establish Redis, we do some caching with Redis, and then the fourth task was establishing the security layer with Spring Security, and we would conclude it with error handling as the last task. So we didn't get to handling, we haven't gotten to handling Redis, and also we haven't gotten to Spring Security. What we're able to do was, one, we're able to establish this persistence layer, which just has one entity, the user, which I think is the one that I'm sharing currently. So we have this user entity. You can see it's marked with the @entity annotation. And here we were able to explore things about the primary key setup. Then we're able to add all the properties that are mentioned there, the ID, the username, password, email, and we're able to establish database layer constraints, like this username constraints that checks the length of the username. We're able to utilize some of the inbuilt JPA validation annotations, like checking the size and checking whether it can be null. I mean, ensuring that the field cannot store null, and so on and so on. So, so this is what we're able to do. We're able to also learn some new annotations like create timestamp and update timestamp, which automatically generates the timestamps, and that makes your work easier. So after that, we were able to establish the repository layer with this user repository. So since we're using JPA, the repository layer just had this interface that extends JPA repository, and it had this notation that marks it as a repository. We added one custom function, exists by username, which I think we were not able to conclude. We had a bit of a debate there about whether the database does whether the rows in the database will be case sensitive or case insensitive. So we decided we were going to do an experiment and determine whether that was the case. And then I think after that so this concluded the repository layer, but we also had a test for it. So we had this user repository test. We wrote this user repository test, which uses test entity manager to do the testing. And What it basically did was it tried to persist the entity that we had there and ensured that that entity is persisted using this persistent flash function. Let me just check whether that test still passes. Okay, looks like we're in the middle of something, so some bits of this are broken. Just comment that out. So yeah, that test looks like, yeah, that test still passes. So this was just to check that we had the persistence layer done. Then, of course, then we moved to REST, where we worked on this authentication controller. And with the authentication controller, we introduced this idea of authentication service to create like a service layer in between our quote-unquote front end, which is the REST endpoints, a middle layer, which is the service layer, and then our persistence layer, which is the JBE. So auth controller was working with this auth service. Auth service is just handling registration and login. And in the controller, we had this register endpoint and login endpoint, which I see we didn't finish implementing. But the register user endpoint seems to have been concluded. For the endpoints, we had a test to validate the thing we're doing. That is in this authentication controller test. And with this, we're using mock MVC. And we were mocking, we're basically injecting auth service for the test because it's a field in the authentication controller. And yeah, so for instance, this is testing the registration endpoint, and this one is testing the login endpoint. I can imagine the registration endpoint should be good. Yeah, so we didn't break that, but we might have broken login endpoint. So if I execute that, yeah, so that fails. So yeah, I think that's why we left it. Maybe I can look at auth service just to get us back to speed with what we were doing. So auth service is a simple Spring Boot Spring Framework service. It has the component annotation, the stereotype annotation, and all it does is it sits between the repository layer and the REST endpoints. And here, of course, we're injecting user repository, and this would handle the function of registration and login. If I remember correctly, we were able to write some tests for that as well. So there's this authentication service test. I was mainly using Mockito. We were able to inject auth service and user repository as a mock, and we were able to test registration, which I think we got that to work. Yeah, so we got that to work, but the login test is not even completed. So I think we're in the middle of writing this login test before that session ended. So we have some assertions there, but I had to comment this out because it was not done. And I think it was you, Dennis, or maybe Dickens, that introduced this case of not just testing positive scenario, but also testing negative scenario. Was it you, Dennis? If you can remember.
No, it was not me.
Oh, okay. It must have been Dickens then. So instead of just testing this and being happy with the login thing happens, we decided that we would also test to ensure that if incorrect fields are passed in, the login thing would fail. Okay, so I think this is where we left it. So based on the tasks that we had, what we have is this is done. I marked it as done. So task establishing the persistence layer with the entity is done. Then the REST endpoint, we got one bit of it done. So we're still left with these four. So if we get those done, then that means we'll be done with this. And then now we can move on to caching. This whole task was based on session management. So the idea is we have these login and registration endpoints, and also we have these session management endpoints that the client can use to check the status of a user's session. And we would use Redis to speed up that process and utilize Spring Security later on to basically make session management a less manual process and rely more on Spring Security's ability to do session management. So I think at first we'll do our own sort of a replication of what session management entails. And then when we bring in Spring Security, we'll actually look into how Spring Security handles session management, and then we essentially try to do that ourselves. So we try to do that now utilizing Spring Security. Okay. So my rambling there was trying to get all of you up to speed. So is anybody still not clear with the project or what we set out to do, and also what we were able to do? Any questions on any of this, or comments? By the way, if we got like some design incorrectly, this would be a good time. Anyone? Questions, comments, or you can just move to the next step. Okay, I'll take that silence to mean. So now there's this other endpoint of, so we did registration. So registration works, I think, end to end, because with the registration, it will flow from this registration endpoint, which is this, and the registration endpoint calls auth service and registers the user, and auth service essentially takes those registration details and calls user repository, and persistence happens. So if there's a failure, we're able to determine that here, and we're able to establish that this registration service function works with the register user test. Yeah, this one. And then it will convert the after persisting the user, then it will return a resource. So we under user resource, we have this from user, which receives the entity and returns back a user resource. So the user resource is what is sent back after the HTTP request is completed. So I think that's why we marked that as done. So now we can look at login, which we already started working on. And with login, we have the endpoint described there. The endpoint is API/API/login, and it receives this as the payload, which is a payload containing the username and the password, which I think we're able to represent in our code with this login resource, which just has the username and the password. And so after registration, we are supposed to return. So in the response, we are returning an object that contains a resource that contains session ID only. So I think that's why we still went with session resource, which just has session ID. Although here we could probably use just a plain string, but it's good because if we use the whole record, it will be converted into a JSON payload, and that will handle having the key for that JSON value. So I think that was a good choice. So where have I gone? So that's what we had set up, but the endpoint, the function for the endpoint is not implemented. So we still need to do that. So let's look at the controller test. Yes? Yes, Alex? Hey, how are you?
Oh, I'm good. Okay, so I have this question about this generic class. The response, okay, is it the response entity? that you are wrapping the nini. Yeah. Oh, I'm currently learning Spring Boot, so I've encountered that word several. So could you please explain?
So what is response entity? So response entity, I'm glad you brought up generics, because as you can see, this is a generic class. And it's generic because if we see those brackets, we know that it means that we can essentially use pretty much any type here. So it doesn't have to be user resource. But what this response entity does is it implements something in the HTTP protocol. Because here, essentially, we are working with HTTP protocol. And in HTTP, you usually have, of course, you have a client. And you have a client on one side. And this client can be a browser. So a user that's going through your system through a browser. And you can have like an Android application. So somebody is going through this through some application on Android, iOS application. So somebody is going through this with an iOS application, and it can be anything. It can even be some program like Carl, or it can be Postman. So the clients can be a lot of things, but I think the most common one is a browser. So let's imagine somebody is going through your application, using your application through a browser. There's other component in the HTTP protocol is a server. So a server is the thing that is providing the content. So if we imagine, like in our local case, we have iTax. So iTax runs on some server within KRA's like internal systems. Maybe they are renting it from AWS in some other country, or they have them in the basement of that building. So they have servers. They have some physical servers somewhere. So the client is trying to access things from that server, like for instance, items. This could also be like if you're doing a Google search, of course, if you're accessing Google from your browser, you'll be accessing Google's servers. So the server is the machine that's providing the content for you. But I'm sure with that, I'm preaching to the choir. So this client server communication, it happens through a HTTP request. So the client sends a HTTP request. So here client sends HTTP request, and the server, of course, the server receives this HTTP request, and it returns, so the server returns HTTP response as a result. So you get a HTTP request from the client, from this browser, and the server, of course, will receive that HTTP request, and then it will process that request and return a HTTP response. So that's how the communication happens. So an example of that would be something like so you're trying to, let's imagine you're trying to search for hotels. So so get hotels in your location. So maybe you can say where you are. So the server will receive this, process it, and then it will return a response, and the response will have a list of hotels. So where does response entity come in? So response entity represents this response from the server. So when you want to communicate back to the client application, like the browser or a mobile application, whichever thing that's trying to access a resource from your server, you return the response and you wrap the response in a response entity. So that is what this object is for. So you can think of it as response entity. A response entity is a representation of the HTTP response. So it wraps the HTTP response. representation. So when you want to represent a HTTP response using Spring Boot, you use the response entity. That forms your HTTP response. And the request that we're talking about, the request here that's from the client, it's this. This is, and so that's why we're using this annotation, request body, because this is what the client is sending us. Okay. Just to emphasize it a bit, if we go to the documentation for this, because this is, everything is code, so you can always read it and see what's happening. You'd see response entity forms a HTTP entity. We'll ignore that, but it's a class. It's a generic class. It even has the T parameterized type. And the documentation says that, so this is an extension of HTTP that HTTP entity that adds a HTTP status code used in that. You can ignore as template, as well as controller methods. Anything here that we can use. Okay, so the documentation is not very explicit as my explanation, but essentially it's basically the response from the server. It's a way of representing the response that you're sending as the server. Yeah, so this HTTP entity, they're saying represents an HTTP request or response entity consisting of headers and bodies and so on. So if you know about the HTTP protocol, when a server is communicating back to the client, you can communicate back to the client using status codes. Status codes are like 300, 301, 400, 500, and those status codes will allow the client to understand what's happening in a more concise way. So like if you respond with a 500, this means something went wrong. So this is internal server error. So this is telling the client, it's not your fault, something bad happened on the server. We were not able to process a request. So something like 4, which is very popular, is not found. So the thing you're looking for is not on this server. So these hotels that you're looking for are not present. So these status codes are part of it, but also you can send messages, plain messages, like you could say an error card. It can be part of your response. On top of that, so you can combine, so yeah, so you can send status codes like 500, 404. You can send messages like an error card or internal server error or whatever, but also you can send back data, and data would be like the list of hotels we're talking about. So all of these, you can put them together, the status code, the message, and the data, and if you put all of those together, they would form the HTTP response. And the mapping for HTTP response within Spring Boot is response entity. So whenever you see response entity, just imagine HTTP response. And the parameterized type represents the data. The status code is already built into the HTTP response. So for instance, response data here that we are sending back is the user resource. So that's what we are passing as the parameterized type. And when we return the response, this is the status code. This can also be not found here. It can also be internal server error. It can be multiple status codes. So for us, we're using status code created, which is 201, telling the client that the resource they are trying to create into the server was actually persisted or saved. But the data we are sending is this user resource. So you see, we are passing the status code and the data separately. I don't know if that explains it.
Oh, yeah.
It's clear now.
Yeah.
Okay. Anybody else want to add on the response entity thing? Maybe something I missed.
I think your explanation was quite detailed and it captured everything. But then maybe you could just touch on what happens when you don't use it.
When you don't use it?
There's an option of not using the response entity, right?
Oh, okay, that's new to me. Yeah.
Because what happens when you don't use it is that Spring Boot will handle the response for you. So by default, it will set the response status to 200 OK. So you use the response entity when you want to have control over the response. So I want, when I create a resource, I want a 201. So that means to override Spring Boot default behavior of returning 200 for everything means I'll use a response entity and I'll pass in the status that I want. Like you can pass in status headers just like you have said. So if you don't use it, Spring Boot will use the default 200 response, like OK, the OK response. But then if you want to have control over the response, you use response entity. So yeah.
That's very interesting. I'll be honest, I didn't know that.
Yeah, because normally when I like build endpoints, so when I don't need to have control over the response, I just let Spring Boot return 200 OK. So, but then when I want specific like status, I'll use the response entity. Yeah.
I have to be honest, I didn't know that was possible. I always assumed that in every endpoint you have to return a response entity, but it's very interesting. So you can have a controller function that returns void.
Not void, because you can have, I think it will handle it for you. You'll specify the type that needs to be returned. Then by default, you'll just say, like, if you're returning a user resource, you'll say public user get user. So it will return a user, but then by default, the status will be 200 OK. So yeah.
So you're just returning the object.
Yeah.
Wow.
But then if you want to have more control, you use response entity.
Wow, that is super interesting. I didn't know that. So I didn't know that. Maybe I got too used to using a response entity that I forgot that you didn't need to use it at all.
But then also mostly I normally just use it on like a get endpoint. Like most other endpoints, I normally just use a response entity. But some get endpoints that I normally implement, I just leave it. I just specify the type and let Spring Boot handle the rest.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. That takes me back. So I'm sure most of us are in the Kenyan context, and we've worked with the Daraja API. I'm saying this because I've seen Brian's comment. So Brian is saying, I've actually seen instances where endpoints return object or map. Yeah, and that reminded me of Daraja because the way M-Pesa, for anybody who doesn't know about Daraja, so it's the endpoint that developers use to integrate a series of endpoints that are provided by Safaricom, M-Pesa, that you can use to integrate with the M-Pesa payment processing systems. So I think the endpoint, the callback. So the way it works is there's a webhook where you can say, okay, I want a customer is trying to buy something from me. So I have their phone number, so I'll send an STK push, which is basically a prompt, like a push notification to their device. And when it gets to their device, they'll enter the PIN, and then after they enter the PIN and they have the money that's required, they pay for the thing, and then Safaricom is able to tell me whether they paid or not. And the way this thing works, because it's an asynchronous process, it's not a linear process in that when you send the request, you cannot block your server side waiting for the customer to enter the PIN. Your system still needs to work, and M-Pesa also will not block their systems waiting for the customer to enter their PIN. So what they do is you'll send the request for the transaction, and then everybody else, all the servers, your server and the Safaricom servers, will forget about that transaction. And then if the customer enters the PIN and the transaction is processed correctly, then Safaricom will send you a callback message, which is basically basically means they'll communicate later through a different endpoint telling you that this transaction went well. Now the problem is the payload that I use to send back that communication is I don't know if they probably fixed it because I did these integrations a long time ago. It has like 100 fields. It's a very complicated payload. If you look at the JSON, it's nested, it has internal objects, and those objects have like additional fields, and it's a very complicated endpoint. So the way people solved it was in the callback you receive you just define a map, because you cannot take that whole JSON and represent it like a record, like we were doing here. Just to describe what I'm talking about. So like we were doing with this login resource, if you imagine this is being sent from the client, it's very easy to represent this because the JSON will just be a key with the username, will have the username, then you have another key that has password and the password. But with JSON, you guys know it can get nested. You can have nested objects within the JSON. So the Daraja one, the object is extremely nested that it's difficult to do this. It's hard to represent it in terms of a Java class. So the way people fixed it was the endpoint will just receive a map, and that map would have key value pairs. And because JSON is key value pairs, then you don't need to represent everything that Safaricom is trying to send you back. So anyway, I sorry for the long-winded thing, but it just reminded me of that scenario. Anybody integrating with are any of you guys integrating with the Daraja API recently? Is it still the same situation, or did they simplify that that payload, the callback payload, the one that you receive for payment confirmation? If any of you have done M-Pesa integration recently? Mm-hmm.
The callback is still nested. Actually.
Oh, okay. That time they didn't even have docs. I'm surprised they have docs now. So it's in this portal. So APIs here.
Yeah, navigation by APIs, then filter by payments.
Which one?
Payments.
Oh, this one. Oh, okay.
Yeah, then the second one, click on simulate. So,
oh, the M-Pesa Express.
yeah, so when you scroll down, you just see the callback.
Yeah, it's still a mess. Although this is the one where you send to that's the request, right?
Yeah.
So response for that, and then callback.
The callback. So
yeah, yes, this is the one I was referring to. Yeah, so you get this. So this when it fails, you get a simple JSON. So this one you can represent in Java, but it will still be a mess because for whatever reason somebody decided to start with body here when they could just have this JSON object. This is enough. Why nest it? There's like 2 layers of nesting there that you don't need. Okay, then of course this is the one I was referring to, where you get the callback, and first of all, of course, there's there's the unnecessary nesting. This would be one object in your Java code. Then there's some extra nesting here, and that nesting has another object, and inside that object you have this unnecessary nesting, and then inside that again you have this other one that can be, oh yeah, of course you have the potential array, and then you have each item here represented differently.
I'm wondering, is there something like nested classes, and could it solve this?
Because when you write classes, you have to like be explicit. You'll have to now write multiple classes. So this would become multiple classes. So you have a class that represents body. You have a class body, and then you have a class STK callback. Inside that class STK callback, you have a field, a merchant request, whatever, result code, and then you have another class callback metadata. And inside that callback metadata, you have an array of item, and that array of item has property data. It's a mess. It's a total mess.
Yeah.
Yeah. So back to the question, by the way, also, this would be okay. So this callbacks is a bit different, but on Safaricom's side, on their servers, this would be the response entity. So this would be the response entity on their side, and then on our server, this would be the request body. Because when they're sending back this callback, they're actually acting like a client to our server. So it's like a different situation, but they're acting like a client to our server. And then when we're sending the initial request, we're acting as the server, and of course, they would have this in their request body, and for us, we would have it in, or they would have this in their, of course, the request body, and for us, we'd have it in our response entity, or something like that. But anyway, I just remembered this. Looks like there haven't been any improvements. So I think that answers the question. If it's not clear, or anybody wants, does anybody want to add to this discussion of a response entity? So Brian is saying Surf probably added more fields. Yeah, likely. They're probably making it more complicated. Which it's unnecessary, because they could just do a V2 API. I mean, that's how we do it. If they don't want to modify the original API, they could do a V2 API, and this V2 API can have a better structured payload. Internally, it will still call the same services and call the same persistence layer, of course. They will not need to rewrite that. They just change the endpoints that developers have an easier time. And they don't have to go through hell trying to integrate with them. So Brian is just saying it probably looks cleaner and prettier on their code base. Most definitely. Or these are legacy systems. It probably looks more dangerous on their system. That's why they don't want to touch it. Nobody understands that particular bit of the code. So nobody wants to go and try and fix it. Because you fix that, probably PesaPal goes offline something. And 90% of the businesses in the country. So people don't want to touch it. Anybody else want to add to the discussion of response entity? Maybe explain it better. Steve is saying, when writing new endpoints, should we enforce wrapping our response in response entity by default to explicitly manage the HTTP status, or do we prefer letting Jackson serialize plain objects and rely on global exception interceptors for non-200 response code? So Stephen is bringing in a very important discussion, which is there are two things there. Of course, there is a thing we discussed with I think it was Dickens, if not Dennis. I think it was Dickens, on the ability to just return an object, where you don't need to return response entity. So you can do that and allow Spring Boot to always do like a 200 OK for you. But of course, that means, one, you'll not be conforming properly to the HTTP protocol. And as developers, when we're building systems, we want to standardize them. One way to standardize systems is to have them conform to protocols. So protocols and architectural patterns. So HTTP is a protocol. If you look at the RFC for HTTP, which is a good read, I even have it. Oh, I wrote about it. Actually I did some series of articles on it. But let me go to the RFC or HTTP protocol. So this is the specification document for HTTP. I'll just share the link for anyone who wants to go through it after. So this RFC talks about what counts as a server-side or a client application that conforms to the HTTP protocol. So what it means to implement the HTTP protocol. And here, the reason why they do these documents and the reason they do these things is so that systems can be standardized, so that you don't have too much chaos in the internet. So a good example is the status codes. The fact that we know these status codes and what they mean, it means I don't need to be friends with the guy at who is maintaining that Daraja component of that component of the M-Pesa system. If they send me a 401, I know what they mean. They are telling me I didn't use the correct credentials, or I'm unauthorized to access something I'm trying to access. If they send me a 200, I know what that means. So that standardization simplifies communication on the internet, and it's important also when you're building your own systems to conform to those standards. So, for instance, in the case where you're just returning an object and not returning explicit status codes, because as we discussed, although I don't use it, but from what I got from what Dickens was explaining is, by default, Spring will just return a 200 if nothing goes wrong. But you might want to be more explicit in your communication. So like in our case, if we look at our endpoint, it's meant to create a new object on the server. Or to use HTTP terms, it's creating a new resource on the server. So when that request succeeds, the thing we should communicate back to the client is 201. We should send them a 201. If we send them a 200, that's very open. You can tell it might mean nothing went wrong, but we are not sure whether the object was created or not. And since what the client is worried about here is whether or not the object they were sending to the server is actually created. So sending them a 201 is much better because it also means we are conforming to the HTTP protocol. And even I think in the Java doc, you can see it's referencing it's referencing the RFC I was talking about. And it's basically talking about the status codes. So it's important to be explicit. And one way to be explicit is to, in my opinion, return response entity. Because when you return response entity, by default, it gives you an opportunity, or to some degree, it forces you to specify the actual status code. So instead of just saying 200, you can say the thing was created, or we accepted the thing, or the content you're looking for does not exist, but we're able to process your request either way, and so on. So being explicit, in my opinion, would be better. I don't know if you guys have a different opinion on that, but for me, I would prefer using response entity instead of returning objects. What do you guys think? Patrick, like what would be your opinion on this? Or anyone else?
Hello.
Hey, Patrick.
Hi, Sam.
How are you doing?
And hi, everyone. I'm fine. So, okay, the response entity is the same as the response from Jakarta EE. Yes. So, I would say for responses that you are returning just the data, whereby the user has done a get request to get data. I think returning either response entity or that's just the object is actually there's no problem because both will return at 200. But now when you want now to return another HTTP status, it's always advisable to use a response entity.
Servlet, the default behavior is you can return an object and it will just do a 200.
It is JAX RS.
Oh, JAX RS, not
Yes, not Servlet.
Okay.
Yes.
Let me see if I can find it. Okay, I'm getting the Oracle one. Jakarta, JAX RS spec. So JAX RS just stands for Jakarta RESTful Web Services, and this is the specification for. Okay, I noticed Servlets is already in 6.1, so I thought JAX RS would also be on 6.1. I think you can just look at it.
Okay, JAX RS came afterwards.
Oh,
after Servlets.
Oh,
yes.
Okay. So that's why it's a bit.
It's built upon Servlets. Okay, it's still in the document, but I think you can just look at the Google AI, the summary was just like the document.
Okay, okay. I was hoping to get something from the specification, because
Okay, it's still there.
uh,
Yes, it's still there.
okay. So there's resources, there's providers, the client API, filters and interceptors, which I think this is from Servlets, and SSEs. I was hoping they have a specification for an equivalent of response entity. Resource access. Okay, before I give up, let me check one last time. So it covers resources. Maybe it's somewhere inside.
Maybe return type 3.3.3.
3.3.3 of this one. Yeah.
Maybe
It
that.
yeah, it could be.
There is response.
Yeah. So resource method may return void, response, generic entity, or another Java type. These return types are mapped to a response entity body as follows. Oh, so you can return void, you can return an object, or you can return a response. So would the response be the equivalent of response entity?
Yes. So they specify the headers, the status code, the cache, anything that you want to specify there.
Oh, nice. So this dies. So the generic entity would be like our object. If we're returning a person from that endpoint, it would be the person, result in an entity body mapped from entity properties of a generic entity. If the return value is not null, a 200 status code is used. Oh, wait, so there's a condition. So 200 is only sent if we are not returning null. A null return value results in a 204. 204 stands for 204 is no content. Okay. So I guess this is also important to consider. So it doesn't always return 200. If the value you're returning happens to be null, you get a different status code.
Okay, I think even the response entity from Spring will do the same.
It seems to be the case, which by the way we can experiment on and see what happens. But this is interesting. Thanks for sharing this, Patrick. So anybody who doesn't know, this is, so within Java, of course, we have the Jakarta EE specification that actually defines how to implement backend applications with Java. And that specification is implemented by some libraries within Jakarta, like JAX-RS, Jakarta Servlet, spec. So Jakarta Servlet specification defines how that is done, and then there are some libraries that implement it. But also Spring Boot either utilizes some of those implementations like Servlet and builds wrappers around them, or they have their own custom implementations that implement the specification but are different from the reference implementation. Let's try this. Let's try this thing since we've discussed it so much. So we'll just use a sample endpoint here, and this endpoint should return, let's have it return a plain string, and we'll call it get message. So somebody was asking whether we use Postman. So we are still still relying on mock to validate the endpoints. So we are not using Postman or any client library to test. So it's just and 200 refers to success status. But there are more specialized implementation like 201, which would mean created. So anyway, so we have this get message endpoint that just returns a message. So by default, I'll return null for now. And this is in authentication controller. So I'll go to auth controller test. And here I'll have a test. and this test will be, thanks for the question. So this test will be should get message. So this should get message test, of course, we'll be using mock MVC. So with mock MVC, we can perform, you can pass in the method we want to perform. And these are HTTP methods like get, post, put, delete. You can use any of them. So I haven't imported this one yet, which is an opportunity to see where they are coming from. If you have any question, feel free to interrupt by the way. So if I'm doing something wrong or you don't understand what we are doing, feel free to ask. So these are from mock MVC request builders. So here you can find all the HTTP methods, post, delete, get, head, multipart for file download and file upload. For file upload mostly. I don't know if people use it for file download. Options, which I don't use. I don't know if anybody uses options. So options comes into your server and it scans and finds the endpoints that the client can call. I think that's what that does. It's also defined in the HTTP spec. If you want to, so mock MVC, and so we have patch, we have put, delete, get, head, and so we can get all of them. So here I'll just use HTTP get, and that will allow us to do a get request here. And of course we are hitting API slash this is which endpoint, so it's slash API. Did I even give it? Okay, I didn't even give it a mapping. So let's map it to get mapping for slash message. So we're just using this for test. It's not related to the main task we were doing, but just to see what happens. So we go to slash message. We are not passing any request body, but we could specify a few things here about this request of ours. We can specify the encoding. Specify it to UTF-8. We can specify that we only accept JSON. So media type application JSON. Media type. So we are not passing a request body for now. We're just testing to see whether we can just have an endpoint that returns anything, and what happens if you return null, what status code will you get. Content type, we are not sending any content, so we might not need to specify this. And then what we can do after is undo print, undo and call print. So print just allows us to log the HTTP request response cycle and see what is the structure of the HTTP request, what is the structure of the HTTP response, and then expect. So this allows us to specify expectations. So we expect status code to be okay, which is 200, and return. We won't do anything extra after that. Again, if you have any questions, you don't understand what is happening, just unmute, or if I'm doing something wrong and there's a way we can improve it also. So this will perform a get on slash API slash message, and we expect we expect status to be that, but also this has a response body. So this has a response body, and if you guys remember JSON path, so with JSON path you can use it to validate the response body, which this will be interesting because I'm just returning a plain string. So so the request will be text. Does anybody know what the request will be? Because if it's just a single string like hello, it can't be structured as JSON, right?
Does it try to pass the whatever you are returning into JSON?
Even if it does, what will be the key for this? Let's say if I return, if I'm returning hello.
Yeah, true.
Yeah. So it's almost impossible for it to structure it as JSON.
Yeah, I bet we.
Yeah. Yes.
If we return a string, I think in Jakarta, the server will translate it as text. The data format as text. It won't be JSON. Yes. If it is an object, it's the one that will be a JSON.
Let's experiment with that here. So you have to know that also when you're writing your test, because if I try to use JSON path here, it won't work because now the value is different. Although we can still use JSON path because this covers the whole response. And the response, of course, will have the response. It will have the status code and all of that. So let me just try. Let me try and see whether it's possible. So at body dot value is perhaps hello. But for now, we are still doing the previous experiment, so I won't be returning the actual message yet. Instead, I will return okay, so I think this should cover it. Let's see what happens. Okay, so the print function works. So this is our request. Our request is a get message to /API/message, and we only accept JSON, which I should have. That this should in itself fail the test because it should still work because I think since the status code is there and other fields, can still pass as JSON. So body is null, we are not sending anything, and then we can skip this and go to the response. So the response is 200. Error message is null, null. So Patrick, it seems like Spring Boot doesn't conform to the JAX-RS specification because it's giving me a 200, while the specification clearly states that it should give me a 204.
Maybe Oracle should have sold this thing.
But then
yes.
So you have specified the return type. It's a string. So in that case, it will be 200 because you have specified. Like that's how I understand what's written in the docs.
You're correct that this is how within Spring, this is how the expected behavior. I'm just saying it's different from the Jakarta specification for how to implement REST endpoints.
Oh yeah.
Because in the Jakarta specification, you are required to return 204 if the value is null. Which I think we saw it somewhere here. So a null return value results in a 204 status code. I think even with the generic entity, a null return value results in 204. So I'm just saying the Jakarta specification, Spring Boot deviates from the Jakarta specification in that where they are supposed to actually be following the specification. In this case, they've decided to go a different route. But Patrick, if we were writing this with JAX-RS, we would get a 204 if it was null. Have you ever tried it?
Yes. I've not tried it. Yes, but I think when next week I try it and I will give a feedback.
Yeah, just that we can make sure that that they have not lied to us in their spec. Because
Oh, yes.
if you read this and then you go and you tie your business logic to it returning to a 4, you tell your client, if I send it to a 4, it means the value is null, and your client is checking the status code before they check a value, and then maybe it's like an Android application that's using Kotlin, then you hit a null pointer exception, or they try to force cast something, and yeah, it can lead to problems when specifications don't agree. But anyway, at least we know within Spring Boot, and I think Spring Framework at large, if you return null, you get a 200 status code, even if the value is null. So I guess also if we return the message, oh, before I do that, let's see how body is handled. So yeah, so no value at JSON path body. Yeah, so it checked this section and it found that there's no body, because of course it's empty. So even the null is not, this is important, even the null value is not added to the response body. Just returns an empty body. So that's interesting. So I guess if on the client side, if you are trying to unwrap this response from the server, then depending on the language or the framework. So if you're using maybe retrofit on Android and you're trying to unwrap this request, if retrofit finds that the body is empty, it will probably give you null as the body, the value for the body. Yeah, because there's no other way of representing empty within that language. So if it's on the browser, it depends what JavaScript, whichever JavaScript framework you're using decides to do. Like I think there's like fetch or something. Yeah, so it depends with how those will handle that situation. So here, let's return. So when we return hello, we see now the body has hello as plain text. It's not JSON, and JSON path is still not able to locate it. I think it's trying to first go into this body itself and find a JSON key that matches this body JSON key. Okay, so I'm seeing we're already 1 hour in. I would like us to take a small break and then resume. Is that okay? Yes.
Kindly before we break, can you try a method that returns void, like we see what happens?
Yeah, we can try that. So void, which means we are not returning anything. This is actually interesting. Let's see what happens. So with void, the response will, it will behave the same way. It will just be an empty body.
Yeah, okay.
It will just be an empty body. Yeah, because even in the null case, it doesn't put anything in the request body. So
yeah.
I think within the HTTP protocol, it allows you to have an empty response body. So they are, by doing this, they are conforming to the HTTP protocol as well. Awesome. Before we go for break, is there any question? Okay. So so it's 9:11. So we do 2-minute break. We resume at 9:14, 9:14 or 15. So you can grab coffee. You can go to the bathroom if you need to. Grab some tea. And we resume at 9:14. Okay. Don't drop off. It doesn't mean if you drop off, you're just going for a break. All right, I'm back. So it's 9:14 now, my time. So I'll just maybe I'll give 1 minute in case somebody is still hunting around 40. So do a thumbs up if you're back, just to make sure that we don't leave anyone behind. Okay. So since we are doing 2 hours for this particular session, we'll be taking a break in between when we hit the first hour. For it to be like a health break. I think it should be a tradition. Okay, so let's continue. So we looked at we've looked at what happens when you return void. So this was just an experiment, and I think we've seen the outcomes from that experiment. So I think that gives us space to now resume with the thing we were doing. Anybody have a question regarding what the experiment we've just done, or any other thoughts that you might have overlooked? Yes. Yeah. Yes. Actually, that's a very good question because it brings in this topic of controller advice. So there's a way within Spring Boot you can actually, instead of just relying on each endpoint behaving the way they want, you can have a ruler or a judge around every endpoint that is in your system using a programming style called aspect-oriented programming. So of course, maybe before I go to aspect-oriented programming. So if you're not using aspect-oriented programming, you can still return custom errors on your endpoint. So let me just try and get back the endpoint we had for our previous example. So we have this endpoint that, of course, could go to /messages, and all it will do is return a message. So string get message, and you get a message. So if you didn't, let's assume you didn't know about aspect-oriented programming and you wanted to return an error alongside this response, there's one way you can do it. One way that I think is familiar to me is you can have, again, now utilizing generics, what we just learned in the JFE class, if it was a new concept to you. So we can utilize generics here and create a sort of like a wrapper class. For this, I'll call this wrapper class API response. And this API response should have the ability to wrap any response that we send back to the client. So you can make it a record, and it can have fields like, first of all, can we use generics in records? I think we can. Okay, looks like we can't, but I don't know how. So I specify it here. Okay. Does anybody know how to use generics in records?
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
The way you've done it, response.
Here. after,
The BI response
oh,
is there.
oh, okay. Oh, thank you.
Then inside, yes, inside.
Oh,
So T,
mhm.
then data.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you so much for that, Patrick. I had forgotten where to put the thing. Thanks, Patrick. So, so we can specify what data that we can have a parameterized type for what kind of data this API response can contain. But also we can include other things that we want. For instance, we can include a message, which is our own custom message. We can decide to conform to a RESTful API design by having a list here of links. If anybody doesn't know what RESTful, so within RESTful, there is this concept called HETIOS. HETIOS. It stands for Hypermedia as the engine of HETIOS. Yeah, HETIOS. Hypermedia as the engine of application state. And basically, what it means is, I'd like to go to the Wikipedia for it. It means for a REST endpoint to be considered a RESTful endpoint, you can have REST endpoints with which are not completely RESTful. But for it to be RESTful, it needs to tell the client about associated resources. So resources that are associated with the request that the server has just completed processing, so that your clients don't need to have a whole view of all the endpoints on your server. So if maybe you have a student's resource, your client doesn't need to know that they can go to student/ID, student/registration number, student/registration number /v1 student. The client doesn't need to know all the endpoints. Instead, if they request for a student, you can send them a list of links, and those links will contain other places, other URIs that they can use to access more information about the student. Like when I come to Wikipedia, I don't need to already know about this resource called talk. I don't need to know about this. I don't need to know about this. They're already given as part of my initial request. And my initial request was basically just doing a get for this document. So once I have the document, I have all these links that I can go to that I didn't know about beforehand. So that is essentially what HETIOS is. But let's look at the definition for it according to Wikipedia. So Wikipedia says Hypermedia as the engine of application state, HETIOS, is a constraint of the REST software architectural style that distinguishes it from other network architectural styles. So this is like the core of having a RESTful endpoint. And essentially, with HETIOS, a client interacts with a network application whose application server provide information dynamically through hypermedia. Hypermedia, you can think of them as links. A REST client needs little to no prior knowledge. This is where the key part is about how to interact with an application or server beyond a generic understanding of the hypermedia. So like knowing there's a student, knowing there's a user endpoint, but you don't need to know all the sublinks or the sub URIs for that resource. So let's just look at an example here. So you see, this client has requested for account. So get accounts and passed in the account number. And we're going to the bank. So this is a bank system. So in the response, you can just return the account, and the account will have the account number and the balance. But since we are building a RESTful endpoint, on top of returning the account, we return this links value, which contains all the other places that this client can go to access additional resources associated with this bank account that they are requesting for. So they can go to /accounts 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 deposits to get deposits. They can go to accounts /1, 2, 3, 4, 5 withdrawals to get withdrawals. They can go to transfers to get transfers, they can go to /close request to get closed requests. So when a client makes this simple get request, they get all this additional information that allows them to navigate your API. So that's Hetios. And so with our endpoint, we might want to implement Hetios. So you notice it's a list here. So you can also mark it as a list, and this will be links. So I'm bringing it up because now we are trying to customize our response body so that we can include other things like error messages and so on. So this can be the message, and you can have like a custom error. So you could say string error, and you could say this error. Of course, the error can be null. So you can say the value can be null. So you can have the message. Let me get the error above the links, because the links should be the last thing you have. So with this, we have the data, the message, the error, and the links. And with the links, you can have another record here. Call it link. It's a Java record. And maybe we follow this Wikipedia example where we have the name of the endpoint and the URI. So string resource name, the name of the resource, and string URI. Maybe just URI, since, yeah. So that will be the name and the URI. So for each of them, we'll have that. So now, once we have this, of course, I need to import list. In our endpoint, we can decide to return API response. And now we can specify API response, and you can specify the kind of data you want to return. In this case, we are returning a string as the response. And now when we are responding to the client, if everything goes well, we can have the response become an instance of API response. And within the instance of API response, now we can pass in the value. So I'm using record, that's why I have to specify this. I mean, I have to specify everything at the constructor level, though you can have secondary constructors within API response so that when you don't need to pass any of these fields, you can skip them. So here, I know the first field we need to pass is the data, the message, then the error. So, so the data here is hello. The next thing is the message. You'll find most people returning you, giving you a successful message. The error can be, if there's no error, you can return null. And you can include links. So these links can now be an array of links. I think I can try and use this shorthand. Arrays. Okay, there's also another shorthand you can use. This .off, and this will be the name of the link and the link. So perhaps we can say for this, you can say holiday messages and specify that, sorry, there's something I'm missing here. This is representation. So each of these should be a new link. And so this is holiday messages. Holiday messages. So you want to tell the client that they can find holiday messages on this server, and they need to go to /message/holiday. And they can find perhaps it's like that SMS subscription thing that was happening back in the day. Nowadays, I don't get them, where you can subscribe and get quotes. So probably you have an endpoint that does that. So yeah, so that would form the additional things, and then now you just return this response. So this allows you to communicate additional information to the client in a structured way. So that way you can also have error message as part of this. So if something went wrong with processing this request, you can just come here and let's say you experienced some exception while trying to process this, and the exception was maybe file not found error, pass correct file name. Something that you want to communicate explicitly to the client, and you can just pass that here as your error. And that means this will be returned back to your client. So this is one way people approached it. So if we try and see this in action by going to our auth controller test and returning that code that I had deleted. Let's get rid of that. So if we run this again, if everything goes well, so you can see we are still hitting the same endpoint, and the response now has a different structure. You can see now our response is data, which is hello. It has the message successful. It has the error that we wanted, file not found error, pass correct file name. So this would be the error message that we pass back to the client. Well, people don't end up designing their systems very well. They might actually leak some database level or persistence layer implementation errors like incorrect column ID or column password length, constraint violation. The length should be 8 characters, and somebody can use that. So it's really important to make sure you pass whatever you return here. Don't just return everything. Then the links. So you can see we have some links here. Resource name, go to holiday. Links, resource name. Okay, yeah, because it's JSON, it's structured like this. So holiday messages, the URI is /messages/holiday. Love messages. So you can structure this better so that you get rid of this additional key. Love messages go to /message/love quotes. So that's one way you can return the error message. Anybody have any comments or questions on that? Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's true. So back to your question of every response will be a status code 200, correct? Yeah, so that is one problem with doing it like this. So I agree with you, it can actually be a problem.
Yeah, yeah. Because actually the response from the server will be status 200. But then inside, we might have another status code. Yeah.
So that means here we can wrap response entity, and inside response entity, we can have the data, which is our API response, this one, API response. And so that will form our API response. And we can have the status code, HTTP status code, and the status code perhaps here would be created or okay, whichever status code you want to return. So let's imagine this is a case where an exception occurred. We were not able to find a file in the server. So this would be internal server error, perhaps 500 internal server error. So this would help with the remedying that situation. So you still keep your custom API response object that you're trying to reuse for everything, but then you can customize the status code by wrapping that API response with response entity. Any thoughts? But there could be a business case that has you do this. Perhaps the client side, people don't want to know exactly what kind of object to receive from your endpoint. So they know anything that comes from your server will be an API response. So all their endpoints are API response, and then they have the generic type. So they can unwrap the generic type and get custom data from it. I can imagine somebody figuring out how this can end up being useful for them, but I agree, it's a lot of work, and if it's not really solving a very specific business case for you, it's unnecessary. You don't need to do all of that. So you can do this. I think the other important thing, important case here is if you were conforming to REST correctly and building a RESTful endpoint, if we just returned a response entity here without a custom type, would we have a way of enforcing these links, the hypermedia links, if we didn't have like a custom object?
Yeah, I think so. There's something called the
Okay. You said it's called?
URI components.
Oh, it's a Spring Boot thing. Eh? I think I've heard of something like that. Components builder.
Once in a creating post. So after you create a resource, you can return like a link to fetch that resource, like the thing you're talking about.
Okay. So
instead of them like
oh, okay, that's interesting. So you use this to, so do you return it as part of the response entity? Mm-hmm.
Do something like response entity created.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Oh, but here, so okay, so this is where now you use URI component builder to build that URI.
Yeah, but then you must have built it before, like passing it. You do something like normally how I've seen it's done. You see in the what do we call it? In that method, get message. So inside those brackets, that's where you pass URI components builder. Then you use it down there. Yeah. So URI components builder, you name it, Then you use it down there to create that thing. Yeah. Yeah. I think you'll need to repeat slash message. I'm not actually very conversant with it because I've just used it, like, don't even remember. Yeah. Yeah. It's, yeah, it's something I've seen in passing. Yeah. Let me see the response. I might just take the, I don't know, what do we call it? The self. I would try this. This is how I've actually used it for, like, just creating a link for one resource that you have actually created rather than just creating multiple links. Yeah. Let me just access. I'm sending something in the chat, but then it's directly from a code. Okay. Where is this entry?
Or do we prefer letting Jacksons realize plain objects and rely on global exception interceptors for non-200 response? So do we prefer letting Jacksons realize plain objects and rely on object exception? Oh yeah. So I was going to this global exception interceptors because Steve, I think you are aware that you are bringing in AOP, aspect-oriented programming, because that's how you attach those global request interceptors. But on the first part of your question, whether you should use the response entity or just passing objects, I think based on the examples that we've looked at, it is more advisable to return response entity, because if you just return a plain object, very soon you'll find yourself reverse engineering a response entity by trying to attach status codes, error messages. It's better to just use the response entity. I think, at least from my experience, I think that's the best way. We'll cover the second part of your question next. So Dickens, yes, you can talk about the code sample a bit.
Yeah, I think what's happening there, it's an endpoint that creates a product and it returns a product DTO. So part of what I wanted to return was what you're speaking on, the ETOs thing. So in the response, I want to have a URL that links to this resource that I've created. So I'll use the URI components builder to build a URI. Then in the response entity, I'll pass it inside the created, what do I call it, method. So it will be part of what will be returned to the client.
Not done is calling that build and expand function.
URI builder.path, then you specify the path, then build and expand. Yeah, but then this is just one. This is just one link. So for the resource that you've created, what we were trying to do, rather in our illustration, we were trying to put multiple links. So, yeah, I haven't seen how that works.
Yeah. So this will solve for when we want to just return one link, but when we want to return multiple links, we would probably run into some problems with it. But I would like to try it and see it work in action for our case. So we are still getting URI builder from as one of the function parameters, and URI builder. So calling URI builder.path. So URI builder, URI builder.path, and so here we specify the path to the specific resource. Yeah. So I'm seeing /products there. Is it related to this particular function, or Are we just repeating the whole? Okay, I'm saying there's no slash API, which is usually there. So I can just do slash messages here.
Yeah, you can just
Okay, so slash message, then slash just one of them, holiday, for instance, holiday. And so that's the path. And then dot build and expand. Build and expand. And here now we pass in values, right? I guess this is for passing values. I don't know if I can just do key value pairs, or I'll have to do a map. Something build and expand, get ID.
Actually, there was just passing the specific ID.
Oh, okay. So this would be passing maybe the message ID, if it was a specific message. So after build and expand, then seeing you're doing to URI after that. Which makes me wonder, maybe we were supposed to call to URI on the previous function. Maybe that would have worked. We'll try it after. So return, okay, so this other part remains the same. Let's see. So that gives us, nice. It gives us a, so it is structured as a redirect URL.
Also sets the one of the
Oh yeah. Oh, okay. So
it might be different from what
I think it might be solving a routing problem, like a redirection. So after maybe somebody comes to your website, they register. After that registration, you don't want the client application wondering where to take the user next. So it will send them a redirect URL. Then your client can do a call on that endpoint and redirect the user. I think it might be different, because Hetios is meant to communicate what URIs. Okay, it some degree it is, because you're communicating a URI that exists on the server, but it doesn't communicate more than one URI, or at least in the way we implemented it. So I guess it's like a small Hetios. A very specific Hetios. Let me just try and see if maybe we were about to strike gold and we just didn't call that to URI function. Instead, we call build. Okay. Okay. Can I call to URI here? Okay. No. We were nowhere near striking gold. So I guess it's limited to one link. You can just pass one link. Okay, that's nice. Thank you for bringing that to our attention. At least I've learned something there, and I'm sure somebody else has also learned. Does anybody want to comment on that URI component thing, or ask a question? Anyone? Yes. Okay. So then let's continue with the second part of Steve's question. I hope Steve is still here. Okay. Awesome. So let's try and look at AOP. Okay, this is too much code to delete. I'll just leave this here so that if anybody wants to review it after the session, they can check it out. So we're talking about aspect-oriented programming. So one way you can solve this issue of embedding an error inside your response, because you want to pass a custom error message to the user, or some custom information to the user, there's a more intelligent way of solving it. It is through this programming paradigm. or programming style that you can use. So already, if you are programming Java, you should know about one programming paradigm, which is OOP, object-oriented programming. You should also know about functional programming, which is, for us within Java, this is whenever we see somebody using lambdas or passing lambdas into functions, something related to that, or functional interfaces. This is our view of, or the Java language's take on functional programming. So there's another paradigm, which is aspect-oriented programming. Of course, you can do imperative. Java is a family of C language. So it's a child of C. So which means if you want to do imperative or procedural programming, you can still write procedural code. I do procedural code whenever you're writing like a console application. That's not really a CLI. I know with CLI, you execute a command with the parameters, and then you get a response, and then you execute another command. If you can have an interactive console application, is where you give a user options, they select an option, and then that leads to you outputting some things or performing some operation. So when you do this, you probably might end up writing, not probably, you'll definitely end up writing procedural code. Whether you're writing Java or C, C++, whichever language, you'll likely end up writing procedural code for that, because it's top-down with some branching. So now there's another paradigm called AOP, aspect-oriented programming. And what aspect-oriented programming is this is a programming paradigm that allows you to inject, so you can inject operations. You can inject operations in okay, I'm looking for the most plain way to define it. You can inject operations in non-specific code. What I mean by that is, if we have a function, imagine you're working in an accounting firm, and every month they do an audit of a specific account, or you have a program that goes into every account and does a general audit. So you have a function, okay, you have a function called audit that goes into every account and does audit. But when you're auditing accounts, there's some other things that you might want to do as well. You might want to log the account being audited. And your log might be going into like a very specific log file. So you have a log file for logging the accounts that your program was able to audit. Am I spelling audit incorrectly? Is E. Audited. That's being audited. Okay. Then you might want to, so you're logging the account being audited. You might want to log when the audit was completed. So the timestamp. So you want to collect a timestamp for You want to collect a timestamp for when the audit, because the audit process might be a very long process. Imagine this is a client that has maybe 10 million employees, and they have 50,000 branches, and they have 1,000 suppliers. So your audit program will run through all the payroll data, all the supply and procurement data. It will basically take a long time to finish. So what you want to do is log the timestamp for when the audit was completed. Maybe you might also want to log the IP of the node. Imagine you have multiple instances of servers that are running this audit. You want to log the IP of the node that executed the audit. So which server was it? So that if ever you need to retrieve that data, you know which physical server to go to. Yeah, just imagining cases here. So here we have operation that should run before audit, which is log the account being audited. You have operations that should run after the audit. the audit function. And this one also IP of the not being, so this one is also a function that runs after the audit is executed. But also you might want to have some functions that run during the audit. Log the audit progress by timestamp. So when we get to auditing suppliers, log the timestamp where you started auditing suppliers. When we get to auditing sales, log the time that we started auditing the sales, so that if the audit process is interrupted, we know at which point it was interrupted and at what time. And maybe that might allow us to know who interrupted the process. So this might be executed during the audit function. So in the middle. So usually the way most developers would approach this is by adding those functions inside the audit. So most of this you can achieve by, if you have the, let's assume here we have a function, public void audit that does the audit. To log most of this, you might just log maybe write the actual code log, and here you log starting audit at timestamp. We log the timestamp. During the audit, maybe you might want to log starting sales audit and include the timestamp. And after this is done, at the bottom, you might want to log finished auditing, and you might log the timestamp there as well, timestamp. So this is how regularly as developers would probably achieve this. But let's imagine this audit operation is split into multiple functions inside your program. So you have a sales audit function. At the same time, within the same system, you have a procurement audit function. You have additional functions that all do this auditing operation. So if you wanted to do this logging function, you might need to duplicate all of that code into each of those functions. So instead of duplicating the code inside all the functions, of course, the next toolbox would be to use generics. You might use generics, but generics might not suffice for this. You might try to utilize inheritance, but inheritance might not work for it, because with inheritance, you still have to have, at the down level, there has to be like a class that now does the final implementation. So if it is code that is spread all over your code base, and for all those pieces of code, you want to do one common operation, and inheritance and generics doesn't solve it, solve that replication of operations for you, that's where AOP comes in. And AOP allows you to inject operations before, after, or during the execution of a particular function inside your code. What we'll do, you can imagine it like the way, like middlemen, the way it is like a middleman in your program. Before a particular function is executed, it checks the signature of the function. If that signature matches a particular signature, it will do something before the function is executed. If it matches a signature, it might do something after the function is executed. So I guess with this, you guys can see what we are driving at. Let's say some documentation on this. So just look at the Wikipedia for AOP. Wikipedia. Okay, yeah, aspect-oriented programming. So in computing, aspect-oriented programming is a programming paradigm that aims to increase modularity by allowing separation of cross-cutting concerns. So cross-cutting concerns are those operations within your program that have to be executed in multiple places in your program. Logging is a good classic example of cross-cutting concerns. Logging Another cross-cutting concern could be authorization. So you want, before any function is executed, you want to check that the user that is trying to execute that function actually has permission to execute it. So that can also count as a cross-cutting concern. So it does so by adding behavior to existing code. So this is what I was referring to. As that behavior is called an advice. And even when you're actually doing the actual programming, you use this terminology, so it's important. So we're adding behavior into existing code without changing the code itself. So you won't be changing sales audit, you won't be changing procurement audit functions. Instead, you'll be embedding functionality in that piece of code without changing it. Yeah. So without modifying the code. Instead, separately specifying which code is modified via a point cut. So a point cut is the signature I was referring to. So you can tell it any function that ends with audit. If the name ends with audit, or it contains the word audit in it, if before it's executed, do XYZ. Or any class that starts with audit. Before any function event class is executed, do XYZ. So yeah, so that is the point cut. So we have advice, which is the thing that you want to, the procedure or the code that you want to inject inside that function. Point cut is how you distinguish which functions should actually adopt this procedure and which functions can be exempted. Such as log all function calls when the function name begins with set. So you can replace this set with audit in our case. So if the function begins with audit, eject this piece of code. So this allows behaviors that are not central to the business logic, such as logging, to be added to a program without cluttering the code. So instead of adding all these logging things inside all your audit functions, you can basically not have them inside the audit function, but they'll be injected into the audit function without modifying the audit function. Actually really beautiful. So just logging without cluttering the code or core functions. So yeah, so it includes some tools in the Java ecosystem. Now we can okay, so there's some example here: sealed class, extend, start, permit, whatever. But I think we've gotten the gist of what should happen. So there's a library in Java called AspectJ. And AspectJ is a library that allows us to implement aspect-oriented programming in the language. So you can see it's an aspect-oriented programming extension for the Java programming language created by those guys. Yeah. So we can use this as a library to do aspect-oriented programming. You can see it has ways of defining point cut. You can define advices and so on. So since we are in the Spring Boot ecosystem and with the Spring framework, Spring Boot, one thing you learn is that most of these libraries have wrappers. So you don't have to like do your own, basically make your own implementation. Spring Boot has some convenience APIs that allows you to do aspect-oriented programming without interacting with the AspectJ directly. I would encourage you to read a lot of this literature if you're still not familiar with AOP, as that when you're implementing it, at least you understand what's happening underneath. So within Spring, we don't need to use AOP directly. Instead, we'll be using this annotation called controller advice. And there are various annotations, but this is the most popular one, especially for our case, where we want to change the behavior of our controllers without changing our controller functions. So controller advice here, you can see it says, typically the exception handler model attribute method apply with the controller class, in which they do declare if you want such methods to apply more globally. So you can create a class annotated with controller advice, and within that class you can have functions that do global operations like exception handling, which Steve was driving at. You can have init binder. You can have it do REST attributes, and also there's REST controller advice. So if I remember how this works is, so you have a class, you annotate it with controller advice, and once you annotate it, I don't think we even need to pass in this parameter. Once you annotate it with the controller advice, inside the class, you can have functions that use the exception handler annotation. I hope they've documented that there here. So let's just look at exception handler, because that's the one we'll be using to explain what Steve was driving at. So exception handler, the annotation. So basically, exception handler is a function that we can use to define within our controller advice. We can use it to define a function that acts as an advice, if you remember from the AOP documentation. And we can tell it to, whenever this particular error happens, intercept that function and inject this custom behavior. So you can see an example here, although this would normally be controller advice instead of controller. Exception handler, and then you specify the exception. And of course, now you have a function that should intercept that exception and handle it. Let's try and use this in practice. Anybody else who might want to explain that more clearly, or if I got anything wrong regarding AOP? Steve, do you want to catch us up on if there's a more simpler explanation of what AOP is and how you implement it in Spring Boot? Or did you guys get my explanation? If somebody didn't know AOP, the way I explained it, would it be more clear? Patrick?
The way you have explained it is clear.
Oh, okay. Okay. Thanks for that vote of confidence. So if it's clear, then we can try and do an example here. So we can create an advice for our controller. Within this, we want to have a way to intercept any failures in processing any of these requests, in where we have what we are returning here as, so remember within HTTP there is internal server error, and with internal server error we could catch we could respond to the client with the internal server error. If, for instance, we run into a null pointer exception, or maybe we run into a constraint validation exception where they pass some fields that don't match the values in our endpoint. So we can create an advice, and I hope I remember how this is done. So I'll just call this controller error handler, and I'll annotate this with controller advice. And here, so once we annotate with this controller advice, this will act as an advice. And we saw the definition of an advice. It's when the function is intercepted, what piece of code should be executed. So essentially, this means we'll be defining functions here that should intercept all our controller functions, regardless of which class they're in, and inject some additional functionality. And here, we can create a function that intercepts. So when it intercepts it, you have to also remember that at the end of the day, we have to return a response to the client, or at least we should. We should not leave the client hanging. So in all cases, we might need to still return a response entity. We don't know the value that will be returned to that as part of that, but remember we defined a generic response here. So we could just have that. I think I can get away with not specifying the type of the response body. But if this is an error and something goes wrong, we might probably want to, okay, let me leave it as that for now. So here I want to handle, let's say, null pointer exceptions. People usually use this to handle more sophisticated exceptions. So like a constant violation and so on. But let's say I want this to handle a null pointer exception. So we can annotate the method with exception handler. And this exception handler annotation just means that that particular advice will be able to intercept will be able to intercept the exception class that we've specified, and it will compose another response entity object and return that to the client. So if we look at the docs there, they're saying annotation for handling exceptions in specific handler classes, like the one we made here. Handler methods which are annotated with this annotation are allowed to have very flexible signatures. They may have parameters of the following types. You can include a session object, you can include a web request. So you can include multiple parameters for it. So for us, we will just include the throwable, which is the exception class that we want to handle. So here we can say this one handles null pointer exception.class. So that limits it to null pointer exceptions. And I think in the function we're supposed to pass in something, but what I also remember is, so whenever a null pointer exception, this function will occurs, this function will intercept, and it will be able to return a custom response. So let's say we have NPE response here. Is equals to new response entity. And here we can specify the data is null in this case, and HTTP status is HTTP status code is so HTTP status is internal server. Cannot resolve constructor. What am I missing? So I'm passing the data and the HTTP status code. Okay, it's HTTP status code instead of status. Okay. We can also do that, internal server error. So that will return the NPE response, and now we can return that as our response value for that. So there is the issue of the signature. So in this case, I'll try and not use that. Okay, so that is the build. I still need to do something here. Build. Okay, and then I can get rid of that. Okay, yeah, so with this, we should be able to intercept any exception class that matches the null pointer exception, and we'll be able to intercept it instead of handling that NPE within our controller function. So let's say one of these controller functions was throwing an NPE. I'm thinking of how to simulate that NPE. So if so let's see if I can simulate that NPE. So here we're passing in credentials. Okay, we could use this message one. Specify a string some value, and that value could be the path variable. And then, so that is our path variable. The path variable is value. Then if value is equals to value dot is empty, then we throw a null pointer exception. Exception. So there'll be an NPE that will happen in this get message function, but we've not determined what the response entity will be. So what we are hoping is our controller advice will intercept that NPE and it will return this internal server error. And to be sure, I should probably have more information in that. So let me just change the response entity so that we have a string so that we can inject something custom that allows us to know what's happening. So in the body, I'll specify request failed, experienced null exception. Maybe tell the client ensure value is not empty. Null pointer exception, ensure value is not empty. And I think we can return that as the response, or at least attempt to. Because what we are hoping is this handle null pointer exception function will be called without us calling it explicitly in this get message function. So we can go to our controller test and we run it. So we see we sent the message. We didn't pass in the path variable, which is that value. And okay, that gives me a 404 because the path variable forms part of the signature. I should have used params. Okay, I'll just pass a blank path variable. Okay, can't pass a blank value here. How do we test this? It's actually here. I have to use parameters. Let me pass something like test. And on our side here, allow me to, because our time has really went past, I'll try to just have like a rudimentary example so that we just see this interception thing. Content equals, so here what I'm doing is if the content equals test, I'm throwing an NPE just to see whether the NPE will be intercepted. Okay, so so we sent that with /test, which means that there's a valid test. Status is 500. And you can see request failed, null pointer exception, ensure value is not empty. So essentially, we were able, this function was executed without us calling it in our controller. We're able to intercept the point at which that null pointer exception occurred, and we injected our own code into it. So here maybe you can say ensure value is not test. It's not test. And if we run that, the API will be communicating that if the value is test, we throw a null pointer exception. And here we can see that custom message is included. So here you can do some more interesting things, like if a particular error happens, you might want to log it. You might want to call some other service that does something else. You might want to call the police, you know, whatever. But that function of logging or calling the police will not be part of your controller function. It will be some other AOP thing, an advice that is isolated from your controllers. Your controllers remain clean, but the advices can still come in and intercept execution. So any comments or questions on that? I'm actually glad that I was able. I was actually anxious because AOP is a very wide topic, so it kind of like deserves its own session. So if you guys got that, I think that's really good. So back to the thing that brought all of this is Steve's question on what. So in terms of response entity, we've settled it. Use the response entity. Do we prefer letting Jackson serialize plain objects? I'd prefer, of course, Jackson will still do automatic serialization to some degree even if you use response entity, but it's good to wrap that object within response entity and rely on global exception interceptors for non-200 response code. Yeah, it might be a good idea to rely on global exception interceptors, but just like their name, exception interceptors will jump in when there's an exception. If there's a constraint violation, you are doing some, so a client is sending you some data and there's some SQL injection thing that they're trying to do with that, and your validators have actually picked it. You can have your control advice help with that. The NBE example that we just showed can also be an example of that. So yeah. 3 points: use response entity as much as you can, and use control advice instead of trying to add logging and exception code inside your controller functions. That will lead to you designing better APIs, because with the control advice, you were able to specify the status code. So we could change this status code to something else, like if we wanted to do a redirect. If something goes wrong and we want to do a redirect, we can do a 301 here. And 301, we could do not found, we could do other things. So with 301, you have to return it as a 301, but that will allow you to redirect the user. Yeah. Okay. Any comments on AOP? Okay. Wonderful. I think we can end it there, unless there are any questions or comments. But this has been awesome. The whole idea of JBE is we don't come in with a plan. So my job is to just create a starting point, and then you guys will determine where this goes. So I'm glad we did that, and now it led us to some interesting experiments. I'll add all the source code in the same GitHub repository that I shared earlier. So if you guys want to like go through it and check out some of the things, feel free to do that. Let me just add the code that we've done. So this is JBE, and so JBE1, I'll just call it that. And you'll find it on the GitHub. I think I shared the GitHub repository. Did I share it? Yeah. So there it is. So that's it, guys. Next Friday, Joe will be coming to talk about FFM, foreign function and memory API. So we'll not be having a similar session like we had today. I will instead be getting a presentation from Joe, who is telling us about advancements, why we are moving from JNI to FFM. Sorry, FMM. No, FFM actually, foreign function memory API. And I think it will be a very informative session. So be sure to tune in. That is next week on Friday. And of course, next week we'll still have JFE sessions. Yeah. Yeah, indeed, rabbit hole. Absolutely. Okay, so I think I'll let you guys go. Have a wonderful weekend, and see you again next week. And thank you so much for joining.
See you on the next one.
Awesome. Bye.